We are continuing our series today looking at the book of James, this series that we are calling A Word to the Wise, where James, the brother of Jesus, has been given by God some wisdom that he passes down to us to help us to recognize and to live out an authentic faith, a genuine faith that is the real deal. It is more than a set of beliefs that we agree to. It is a way of life that we live, empowered by the grace of God. And sort of the key to all of this, the key to living out this authentic faith is to recognize and embrace that we only live this life by the power of God. It is not something that we achieve by sort of buckling down and setting our minds to it. It is something that God works within us and through us. And I said last week, we are, when we were talking about temptations and the desires that often drive us, that it is a war within us, and it is a war that is won, ironically, through surrender. It is a war where we surrender ourselves to the power of God, and He takes over and works within us to do the things that we cannot do ourselves. And last week when we talked about those temptations, those desires that can kind of get the better of us and drive us, and if those are the things that motivate us, it destroys our relationships. And most of all, it drives a wedge into our relationship with God. And so much of this series, this lesson, is really intended to call us back to whatever degree we may have wandered away from taking faith seriously. It is a call to return, to draw near once again to God, to draw near to Him as we saw last week, and to see that He draws near to us as well. The section last week concluded with this verse here in verse 10 that says, "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will exalt you." Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will exalt you. And as we talk about today the danger of pride, this is an appropriate place to start. Humble yourself before the Lord, and He will exalt you. See, humility is an essential part of following Jesus. It is essential. And without it, pride that takes over will erode our faith. It will destroy our faith. Andrew Murray, a South African missionary and Christian author many years ago, wrote, "Pride must die in you, or nothing of heaven can live in you." Pride must die in you, or nothing of heaven can live in you. Humility is not a nice add-on to following Jesus. It's not that we follow Jesus, and if we can manage to be humble along the way, then that's all the better. Being humble, humility is at the core of what it means to follow Jesus. His invitation to follow Him was to deny yourself, to take up your cross daily and follow Him. And others who were lost in their pride weren't able to come along until they set those notions of pride down. And so we need to set aside our self-importance. We need to see our dependence on God for all things, that we are not independent as we might hope. We depend on Him, and further, we value other people even above ourselves. Pride is a dangerous pitfall for God's children because we are being shaped in the image of God. We are being blessed by our relationship with our Lord, and we have all kinds of blessings that result from that relationship, and He is making us more and more righteous by His power. And as He shapes us and as we mature, as we grow in that journey, we can start to sometimes see the blessings of grace that we have. We can start to see them instead of blessings of grace, we can see them as accomplishments that we deserve because we worked so hard. And that is where Satan gets his foot in the door and starts to bring us up and to puff us up in our pride. What Jesus criticized the most in the religious leaders of his day was the pride that had destroyed them. He says to them in Matthew 23, verses 5 and following, he says to the scribes and Pharisees, or about the scribes and Pharisees, he says, they do all their deeds to be seen by others. They make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. They like all the trappings that come along with the position that they are in. But he goes on in verse 11 to say, the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And Jesus reminds his followers what it's all about. That it's not about getting the praise and the honor and the benefits for yourself. It is about humbling yourself before God and serving him. These guys, it wasn't these scribes and Pharisees, it wasn't that they loved God so much. It wasn't really why they did it. What Jesus saw in them is that they loved the honor for themselves. They didn't love serving God and showing their neighbors the glory of God. They enjoyed the status. They enjoyed the power that it afforded them. And they needed to be reminded. They needed to be reminded who they really were. And so do we. Because when we aren't humble, when we are prideful, we destroy our own faith and we end up working against God's purposes instead of for them. And so just after James says to us, humble yourself and he will exalt you, he goes on to describe what happens when we don't. When we are caught up in pride and arrogance. He goes on to describe this. He says, do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. There's only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? Who are you? That is the question. James wants us to remember who and what you are. To recognize that if we are in the church, we are children of God, regardless of where we are on our spiritual journey and how much we might know or not know along the way. We are equal children in God's family. None of us is more important than another, and when we speak evil, as he says, some versions say slander, which is capturing what he's after here. When we talk down about one another, when we judge one another, we place ourselves above one another, at least in our hearts. And to do so, he describes here, is passing judgment on the law. What he's saying is we're setting ourselves in the place where God alone should be. We're saying, I am above the law. It's others. I've got it figured out. I'm the standard of righteousness. And I hold you to my standard. That's the attitude that he describes here. And so we talk bad about other people and talk down about them. I'm above the law. And humility is essential to combat this because pride teaches us to be self-righteous, to be judgmental towards one another. This is the work of pride. Now, certainly we are in the family of God. We are meant to encourage one another, to admonish one another, and hold each other accountable at times. When we discern that a brother is struggling with sin, we are there to come alongside and to help. But it is meant to be done from the position of one fellow traveler on this journey to another. Not from the position of being above someone and looking down on them. And certainly not to prove. And this is the attitude that works its way. It's certainly not to prove that I'm better than you by pointing out your faults. That's what pride does. Pride is a matter of one person comparing themselves to another. Pride takes no pleasure in a good thing on its own, but in it being better than what someone else has. In being above someone else, pride is all about comparison to another person. And so by its very nature, it tears apart relationships. Look at the example that Jesus gives of this self-righteous, judgmental attitude. And again, he talks about the Pharisees. Jesus in Luke 18:9 told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, treated others with contempt. It says, 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed like this: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners and unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. That's a phrase that keeps coming up over and over again. Jesus has already said it twice this morning, and James has said the same thing. Peter says the same thing. It comes up over and over again. Will we exalt ourselves and leave ourselves to be humbled by God, or will we humble himself and be lifted up in his grace? This Pharisee in the story Jesus tells believes he is righteous because of what he has done. He points out his stats. Look at all the times I've fasted. Look at all the money that I give. Look how righteous I am. That's what he bases his own righteousness on, while the tax collector knows that he isn't righteous, but for the grace of God. Which is the case for all of us, including that Pharisee, except the Pharisee didn't recognize it. It's true of all of us. We are all unrighteous, but for the grace of God, who makes us righteous, who works out his righteousness within us. This is why so many of the Pharisees and other religious leaders of Jesus' time would not receive him. They couldn't humble themselves. They could not, because their concept of righteousness was rooted in themselves. That's the only place they knew where righteousness was. They couldn't humble themselves. Pride teaches us to be self-righteous, teaches us to be like those Pharisees of Jesus' day and to judge one another inappropriately. How many people have been turned away from Jesus by people in churches acting exactly this way, of being self-righteous and judgmental, allowing pride to take over? You know, Satan doesn't really mind if we overcome all manner of temptations regarding sex and money and other vices, as long as he keeps us really proud of ourselves for doing so. Amen. That's why pride is so insidious, because we can get caught up in it and feel really good about it. We can feel that we are better people because of the pride that has consumed us without recognizing what it is. Pride teaches us to be self-righteous and judgmental and to turn people away from Jesus. The second thing that pride does that erodes at our faith James talks about here as he goes on. Verse 13, he says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." For those of you who have been in my class on Ecclesiastes, you should hear some echoes of Ecclesiastes in this phrase here, that you are a mist. Here for a little while and then vanish. That's exactly what the writer of Ecclesiastes teaches us as well, and certainly James is familiar with that. But what he's pointing out here is, again, in the previous section, he was basically saying, who do you think you are? Who are you to judge your neighbor? And now he says, again, what is your life? He keeps asking us these questions. Who are you? What is your life? And this part's maybe a little more subtle than the other. But again, we need to be reminded of our place. And James here describes how we can arrogantly presume on our will, on our plans. Presume that that is what should happen and what will happen. Pride teaches us to expect for the success of our plans to be a priority. Let that soak in case you don't understand. Pride teaches us to expect that this is the default, that the success of our plans should be the priority for what happens. Generally, I've talked about before, I don't like going into situations without a plan. I plan things, I imagine various scenarios as backup plans, and when I'm driving somewhere, I think about where I'm going to park before I get there. I'll look on Google Maps and see where the parking lots are. I'll try to figure these things out. I will overplan sometimes and with contingencies. And I know that planning itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes when things don't go according to plan, when things are not what we expected them to be, it results in us feeling very frustrated. That's maybe natural. But I want you to ask yourself, when things don't go the way that you expected and wanted them to, how angry do you get with that? And are we angry in a sense that we have been denied what we were entitled to for things to go our way? Has something that we are owed in our subconscious been taken from us? If that's the case, it just might be a symptom of pride puffing us up, of assuming that things are supposed to go the way that we planned them, and if not, we've been robbed. We should always hold and expect that our plans just might be different from what God intends, because often they are. Jesus taught us to pray, "Your will be done." But quite often our hearts say, "My will be done." And even if we don't voice those words exactly, our hearts long for my will to be done. Proverbs 16, verse 9, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." In other words, I may think I know what's going to happen. I make plans and I envision what I want to happen, but what ultimately unfolds is God's will. And the sooner I can accept that, the sooner I can recognize and accept that sometimes God's will, often God's will, is a different path than what I had envisioned, then the better off I will be. But humility is what helps us to get there. And so I encourage you, make plans. Make plans. That is responsible to make plans, but hold them loosely. Submit them to God. Submit them to God's will and pray over your plans, however big and small they may be. Your will be done over mine. I told you just a little while ago that I was planning a 40-day sabbatical coming up. As I've mentioned, I am a planner, and I have submitted to the elders a 3-page plan of what I tend to do during my sabbatical, and sort of themes for every week of what I want to be focusing on and studying and thinking about and praying about. And holding that loosely is a challenge. But I've also said, during that time, I want to be open to where the Spirit of God leads. And He may want to shape me and us in ways that I'm not intending at the moment. And I need to be flexible and open and listening to that. And we all, in whatever our plans are, whatever it is, that's what's coming up for me, but whatever it is that you are thinking about, could we humble ourselves about all of our plans? Amen. Could we humble ourselves about the job we want or the job that we don't want? Could we humble ourselves about the purchases that we are thinking about making? Could we humble ourselves about the places that we intend to travel or hope to move? Could we submit all of those plans to God and say, "Your will be done," trusting that if the Lord wills, we will do this or that, as James says? We cannot allow pride to erode our faith, making us self-righteous and judgmental and arrogant about our own will. We cannot allow that to happen. We have to submit our lives to the Lord. Paul says in Romans 12:3, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." He calls for us to see ourselves for what we are: sinners who have been blessed and transformed into saints, not by our power, but by the work of God. To humble ourselves and admit that I don't take any credit for what God has done and where He has brought me this far. We don't want to place ourselves above others, to place ourselves in big and small ways in God's place, whether it's over other people or demanding on our own will to be done. When that happens, we have fallen into dangerous pride. As James says in his next verse, "As it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil." All such boasting and arrogance is evil, he says. This arrogance, this pride that takes over when we lack humility, it has a powerful effect on us. As a tremendously powerful effect, just as it did with the Pharisees in Jesus' day, and our arrogance can leave us blinded to where we can't even see the wonder, the magnificence of God and the goodness of His will. Because we start to think we're great. We start to think our will is what should be done, and it gets in the way of seeing the goodness, the greatness, the magnificence, the wonder of God and His will. C.S. Lewis, in his masterpiece, Mere Christianity, which if you've never read, I'd encourage you to take a look. He has an entire chapter about pride, and the chapter is titled "The Great Sin," because C.S. Lewis sees pride as kind of the central sin. The central sin that ends up playing out into all sorts of other things. And he recognizes that knowing God, truly knowing God, has a naturally humbling effect on us, because when we see Him, we recognize how far below Him we really are. Right? That's what happened to Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6 when he's caught up into the throne room of heaven and he sees the magnificence of God's presence. And he says, "Woe is me." He believes he's going to die. In that chapter on pride, C.S. Lewis says this. He says, as long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. As long as we are looking down, we're placing ourselves in God's position. And we don't look to Him. And even if we do know Him, at times we might turn away for a while. In fact, as we're describing pride here, maybe that turn away is a turn inward. We turn inward long enough to forget His goodness and end up like Paul describes in Romans 1. He says, although they knew God, they didn't honor Him as God or give thanks to Him. They became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. We don't want to become blind to the greatness of God. We don't want to become blind to the goodness of His will and become blind to our place in His kingdom, exchanging His wisdom for foolishness. We need to come out of our pride and recognize that He is the one who is infallible, not us. He is the one who is eternal, not us. We need to draw near to Him once again. We need to, as the hymn says, turn our eyes upon Jesus, look full in His wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim. The things of earth need to grow strangely dim as we look at our God. We need to be amazed at His magnificence, at His purity, at His power, at His love and His grace. Encourage you, be in awe of your God, and that will shrink your ego. Be in awe of your God, and that will deflate your pride. See that His ways, although they are different and hard to understand for us at some times, are infinitely better. Infinitely better than whatever we could come up with and the plans that we could imagine on our own. And if we understand that, if we understand that His will trumps ours no matter what, and His is always leading to something better than ours, then we can actually rejoice when our plans are thwarted. When things don't go our way, we can strangely find joy in knowing that God is doing something else. And that can draw us back to Him to find our place in the new thing God is doing. So then James, after calling us to humility and highlighting the danger of pride, he says this at the end of this section. He says, so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Now, and if you're reading through James and reading through this section, this verse just kind of feels out of place almost. You're reading through it, it sort of breaks the flow of the thought, and it almost seems like a random good idea that's brought into this other stuff. It's just tacked on to the end here because of the way that it breaks the flow of thought. And people have suggested that this may be, it seems to be, a saying that was already known, that James is quoting here, that he's bringing into the context of his argument that he's quoting, perhaps. But he uses this to punctuate his teaching on being humble and the dangers of pride. And it's as if he's saying, now you know that you should humble yourself. And you better actually do it. Because if you know the good that you should do and you don't do it, then that is sin. And I've told you now what you should do, and so you had better do it. But it also does something else in this context. It also, the very issue of pride often stands in the way of us doing the good that we know we should do. Pride is the thing that often blocks us because we're blinded or we feel too good for something or whatever the case is. Pride is often the thing that stands in the way and prevents us from doing what we know we ought to do. And so, our final point is this. We cannot allow pride to hold us back from doing the good that God has called us to do. We cannot get puffed up in pride and allow ourselves to feel good in ourselves about not doing the things that God has called us to. Pride blocks us in all kinds of ways. Maybe we have a fear of that situation where we might lose some sort of status or image that we think we have. Maybe our pride makes us reluctant to admit a fault that we have, but we really need to. Maybe our pride makes us worry about a situation where we don't have total control of things. Maybe our pride plays out in a desire to be self-sufficient and independent. And so we don't want to go into something that's going to make us look vulnerable, where we have to depend on other people and on God. Or maybe we're upset with somebody and we've been holding a grudge over them for a long time, but doing the ministry that God calls us to requires that we lay that down. And our pride doesn't want to let go of that grudge. Or maybe we're so preoccupied with self-interest out of our pride that we don't even notice the things that God is calling us to. Paul reminds us, Galatians 6:9, let us not grow weary of doing good. In due season we will reap if we don't give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. God is always providing opportunities. I think we miss a lot of them. I think our pride blinds us to them so often, or makes us second guess or quickly forget. But there are opportunities to do good, to reach out, to show Jesus, to work in the service of God's kingdom. Every day that you're at work or in the grocery store or in your home with your children, as you're going about to the post office or wherever it is that you do what you do, there are opportunities to shine. May pride never hold us back. May we humble ourselves enough to see what God is calling us to and do it. And so this morning, may we commit ourselves to humility in our walk following Jesus. May God free us from the snares of self-righteousness and judgmentalism. May He instill within us the goodness of His will, even when it is at odds, maybe especially when it's in odds with ours. May we be so captivated by His greatness that we are compelled to show it to others in the way that we live, everywhere we go. May we be humble and unencumbered by that dangerous pride. In just a moment, I'm going to be at the back of the room, and I'll be there for you if you have any needs this morning. If you want to be baptized and leave your old way of life behind and follow Jesus, we would love to baptize you today. If you just want to talk or you need prayers or anything you need at all, I'll be back there for you during the next song. But let's wrap up with these verses, and then we will sing. 1 Peter 5. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time He may exalt you. If we can be there for you this morning, would you please reach out as we stand and sing?